But so I guess what is the first thing that comes to mind for you when I mention the topic of youth to senior transition?
Yeah, I guess, and it's a great question and quite complex in what you want to achieve, certainly through those younger years of being a youth player. And if you look at how a player progresses depending on their age and stage and the journey that they're actually on, that can be up to anywhere between 10 to 12 years in that youth space before very much then transitioning into the performance phase. So if we link it to here in Australia, and you look at our building blocks moving through sort of that discovery phase from 5 to 9, and then by the time you get up to the top end in that performance phase, you're hoping that you're in a position that a player is able to be polished off and passed on to the top, and they have all the tools that is required to move into that space. And noting that every single player is different and their journey will be different, and depending on their skill set that they have that relates to the psychological, the social, technical, tactical, and then that physical component as well, they'll be at different levels, and then where they actually fit into that senior space can be quite different as well. So it's a tough question. I could probably talk about it all day, and depending on whether you're as an example, an NPL youth player going through BYL or the GYL, the girls' youth leagues or the boys' youth leagues here, transitioning into that senior space might be very different to you being a part of a Hull Academy and transitioning from that youth space again, but now into that more professional senior environment where you're getting offered your first professional contract. And I think, well, I know that I've always said it's easy to get the contract. It's harder to actually keep the contract. And that's what will show is the true test of your dedication time as an individual to get into that level. But then once you're at that level, staying at that level, because the sacrifice it takes to get there, but to stay there is incredibly challenging for individuals. And I guess it's important for us as coaches and coach developers that we're mindful of it should always be about the individual and putting the individual first, and noting that every single individual is different and how they potentially retain that information and then actually put that into practice. But knowing who they are as individuals is incredibly important to supporting them on their journey and moving them through those phases or the age and stage, like I say, transitioning into that more performance phase or senior environment.
Fantastic. And have you yourself experienced this transition as a player? And if so, what do you personally remember from that experience? Was it a positive one for you? Was it a negative experience, and maybe why? What were possibly some of your successes with it, or what were some of your challenges with it? Yeah, just interested to sort of unpack what that might have looked like for you if you did.
Yeah, well, obviously, I've got a distinct accent. I'm definitely not from Australia, although I am now Australian. But what I will say is, growing up in the UK, it was dog eat dog to a certain extent in terms of, one, opportunities, and two, depending again on the age and stage that you're actually at, being afforded that opportunity to move into a professional environment. I played at a reasonable level, what you would potentially call semi-professional. I never actually made it into the professional ranks, and the highest I would have got to would have been what was then called the conference league, and never even earned any stripes in that particular league. So I grew up in a town called Stevenage. I was originally from the northeast, and moving down from the northeast at 9 years of age. That was my first introduction to football. And then from the ages of 9 through to 16, 17, I was with one club as a youth club. And then I was afforded the opportunity by Stevenage FC to do what was called your youth training. scheme, which was a full-time program, which was complemented both by going to training in the mornings from 9:30 until 12, and then and doing that 5 days a week, and then going into the classroom between 1:30 until 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and that was a daily thing I did for 2 years as a YTS player. And then it was the time to then obviously be afforded the opportunity to sign a professional contract, and unfortunately I never made it to that level, so I never actually transitioned from that youth. I was picked up as a youth player late on, so ordinarily these or historically those types of contracts for youth players generally get given out around the age of 16 to 18, and nowadays you probably will sign as a youth player from the ages of 9 potentially, then you move into 12s, and then that 12s all the way up through to 16, 17s, and then offered a pro contract after that. And unfortunately I never made it, and it was a culmination of things for me individually. The injury was one part and one factor. Having a knee reconstruction certainly hampered my development individually, but not my development just physically, but also mentally and socially as well. I found it incredibly difficult at the time to deal with that type of injury. And growing up at that time, being an 18, 19-year-old, you're also presented with other distractions as well, which present their own challenges in themselves. And so going through rehabilitation, it was incredibly difficult for me, but hindsight's a wonderful thing, and we always talk about, if you could do it all over again, would you do it differently? Yeah, 100% you would. But I think where I'm at now, certainly from a coach development perspective and a technical director perspective, I like to think that I'll take my learnings as a youth player transitioning into the senior space have allowed me or afforded me to then educate the next generation of player as to potentially what the do's and don'ts are of being a youth player transitioning in, and what those distractions that may present themselves, and how do you actually put a framework or a support mechanism around you to give yourself the best opportunity to transition into that next level. And yeah, I've had some very, very good experiences as a youth player, and I had some very, very bad experiences as a youth player. Being released as a youth player, thinking at the time that I was good enough and worthy of a contract, not receiving that contract, and then how I actually reacted personally and individually to not getting that contract was quite immature. And again, that's easy to say looking back, but what it has done is it's set me up. And during my time at Stevenage, we did our first coaching course, and I was never ever going to use that, or I thought I was never ever going to use that, and it ended up being my savior, because it then allowed me to take stock of where I was as a player, but more importantly, understand that if I was only ever going to play semi-professional football, I was never going to earn a living from it, but I really wanted to stay in football full time. So that was then my sort of kickstart, kick up the bum, if you will, to then really knuckle down and say, I'm going to make a go of this, and I want to be involved in football full time. And if not as a player, looking at other opportunities. So that was a real light bulb moment for me, transitioning through. And I had a very good semi-professional career, played around a lot of the local leagues, and did really quite well. And those then opportunities presented other opportunities in the coaching space to afford me opportunities to go overseas and coach and play as well. So a mixed bag. And again, I could talk for hours as to what each of those individual experiences are, but some very, very good ones and some bad ones. But along the journey have provided me much more in terms of the tools in my tool bag now to be able to then offload that experience and provide that insight to the next generation of players moving through.
So that's a great story, by the way, but that sort of leads perfectly into the next question. You sort of touched on it. So maybe just that little bit more, we'll unpack it a little bit more. So I guess now that you are a coach or a technical director, how would you approach the transition differently with the knowledge that you now have? So if you were to pick some sort of key areas that you would sort of, work on or do something differently in that space to give you that success, or give somebody else that success of making that transition, what would you specifically look at?
Yeah, it seems quite simple. When I talked to before, the sort of the psychological and the social aspect, I think that needs to have a much greater emphasis in modern day society and the way that we live our lives both on and off the field. And I think sometimes that has in the past been neglected. And certainly as part of my own journey, I think that those two in particular were very much pushed aside, and it was more of a focus on the technical, tactical and the physical side. And if anything, it was more on the physical first, then the technical, and then the tactical, and then psychological and social got completely left behind. So now I've shifted the way I approach how we do both player development and coach development, that it's more important to be a good person, and the characteristics of what is a good person, how do they actually interact with their peers, around other players, around the coaching staff, etc. So it's much bigger to look at that side and being self-aware. So I'll place, I guess now, a much greater emphasis on those two pillars of psychological and social, to try and give the players the best opportunity to then develop their technique, and then how does that individual technique then fit into the game, the team game, if you will, and where they fit and what they'll actually bring as an individual. But having all of those elements, and eventually, if you work through the journey of a player, I would like to think that the order is very much starting with that psychological and social, and then going into the technique of a player, them wanting to be intrinsically motivated to be the best version of themselves, but also back themselves in every moment. And we have conversations daily at Football New South Wales about players being adaptable, creative, and having that no fear of failure, that can strive to win every single moment. But that takes a really good mindset and a strong mindset. And I firmly believe now that that mindset can be developed if it's worked within the right environment, if the right environment is created for an individual to grow. And if you talk to growth mindset versus closed mindset, that's certainly environments now that we try to create to develop the individuals, is to come in, the door is open, you're welcome to come in, and you're welcome to leave, but hopefully the environment we create when you walk through the door, your thirst for knowledge is there. And then we provide you that knowledge, and you want more and more because of the environment that we actually create. So they never actually want to leave the room. They want to continue to be in the room and be a part of the journey as an individual, which will aid in the collective team goal at the end of the day.
Yeah, fantastic. So I guess what are the main differences that that you think exist between the youth and senior environments, if we talk about an environment per se?
Yeah, there's distinct differences depending again on the age and stage that you're actually working in. So it's one, understanding that age and stage that you're working in as well. So if you're working with a player in the younger age groups from 9s to 12s, your focus is going to be very different. It's very much an individual developing their technique and understanding that you want players to be able to pass, receive and run with the ball and be competent to be able to do that, and do that with less space and time, and develop themselves. And that's not just from 9s to 12, but that's all the way through, transitioning into those senior environments as well. And the higher up you go, the less space and time you have. So the more competent you are in being able to do those things and execute those things successfully with successful outcomes as an individual, as part of that team objective, is only going to set you aside. Unfortunately, I still think at times there's an approach whereby we place too much emphasis on youth players and treating them like as if they're senior players already, and trying to create environments, and potentially coaches actually fall into a trap, maybe that was the way that they were coached. But like everything or anything, football has evolved as well, and so has society, and how we actually deal with individuals in modern day society is potentially very different to historically what has happened or what has been seen as acceptable. So just because that was the way you were coached as a youth player, it doesn't mean that that's the way it should be done in today's environments, in today's society, etc. So you have to be mindful of that as well. And they would be the major differences, I guess, is understanding, one, the age and stage, and then what are the things you really want those players and those individuals to have by the time they move into the next phase, into the next building block, if you will. And like I say, just keep topping up all the time, and making it very individual, having an individual development plan for that player that they take ownership of as well. And going back to the very first question that you asked, is it's about putting ownership on them and giving them the accountability, but then wanting to take that ownership. And because you've empowered them as individuals, they then become intrinsically motivated to actually push the boundaries and reach the bar, and making sure that you never set the bar too high. So if you know them and you know where their strengths are and where they need to be topped up, but you're able to then provide that feedback to them in a manner where they then understand that that is where they need to top up, or they need to really continue to drive that super skill that they may actually have to make it the very best weapon for them as an individual, might give them the opportunity moving forward. So there's a whole raft of things that you can do, but just really, really important for me to know exactly the age and stage you're actually working with, and again, keep treating them as individuals.
Fantastic insights, Warren. So the next question is, how are youth players prepared to manage the transition? And, are there any sort of approaches or strategies that, you may have utilized in the past or currently when it comes to transitioning a youth player into that sort of senior professional space?
Yeah, and again, strategies, there can be plenty, but I think a misconception is that you start football at the age of 5, potentially, sometimes even younger. There seems to be a race to the bottom right now, but from 5 years to by the time you get to 17, 18, 19, and then you should be playing first grade football, and then managing that. Certainly when you go from 16 to 19, it becomes very, very challenging for individuals, and that's both male and female, because you start to see either players accelerate and transition a lot quicker than potentially yourself as an individual, or you're projected into a space where you are that person that's being accelerated into the senior environment, and then there isn't a framework around you to support you, to keep you stable in terms of what your mindset is and your approach. Because when you're playing senior football versus youth football, it's very much about the win, the 3 points, the win at all costs, and also you were wanting to get into that first 11, so it becomes a lot more important. In a lot of the environments now, it's really good to see in youth football that playing time is managed and opportunities are afforded to players to maximise their minutes on the field. But once you actually step into that senior space, it's a very different environment altogether, and like I say, it's a survival of the fittest, if you will, in terms of one, getting into the starting 11, holding down that position in that starting 11. But if you're a young player, there needs to be a framework put around you to constantly remind you that potentially you're still a young player and you're still developing as a young player. And then what is it that you have as a skill set that's, one, got you into that position, but two, is going to keep you there as well. And then be it managed from that psychological and social aspect that we talked to before is incredibly important. And I think if you can take that approach for players transitioning, regardless if they're the one that's actually already accelerated into that senior space, or the one that's just about getting there but they're not quite there, that's incredibly important to deal with as well, because that is the key time where you actually see, not just in football but across many codes, players will actually drop out of the sport altogether because of that fear. They have that fear of failure. They feel as though that they have failed and they haven't made it because their peers around them or the players within their team are obviously moving on and they're not quite there yet. So you have to manage that aspect as well. And that's why it's incredibly important to treat them all as individuals. But I've seen many a player that have been accelerated very, very quickly into the top space and then slowly fall away. And I've also seen players that have been late developers and flourished and bloomed because they were allowed to develop within the youth space still. And when the time was right, they were then pushed in, because eventually everyone catches up. So again, it's just putting a framework around each of the players, treating them as individuals, managing them accordingly, and setting them individual goals. Not necessarily the team goal, but what are your individual goals? Quarter season, half season, by the time you get to the end of the season. And then reflection is incredibly important as well. For them to reflect as individuals, for you to reflect with them as individuals, and then what did they contribute as part of their own individual development plan, but also what did they contribute to the team as part of that plan as well, and did they get successful outcomes, or are there areas or weaknesses that need to be attended to, and again, if you can manage that and do that in a way whereby they embrace it, they understand it, they don't take it as negative criticism, they take it as a proactive approach to actually developing them to give them the best opportunity to succeed, I think that will go a long way as well. And that's easier said than done, obviously.
Excellent. How do you decide if or when a youth player is ready and prepared to make that transition? So are there any, would you say, objective reference points or characteristics or measures that are indicators utilized to help with that decision making?
Yeah, I think so. And I talk to it all the time in and around what are we looking for when we're looking for top athletes, when we're looking for those ones that are going to be the special players, the ones that are going to be the winners. For me, it's basically just wrapping it all up. So like I say, you're going to see players that will develop at different stages. They go through each of those stages, and they're starting to top up their technical and tactical understanding, but that you can see that they're a winner. They have a relentless approach to being brave, adaptable, and being creative, and not only doing it when they're in the youth space, but when they transition into the senior space. That's what you're looking for as well. So they don't have that fear of failure because you've provided that environment for them. They're self-aware, so they understand, and they understand what their personal characteristics are, and then how can they actually use them to maximize the team's performance. It is incredibly important as well, and they become leaders, and leaders are not just the ones that communicate or talk the loudest, but they lead by example, and they lead by their performance as well. So I've seen many a youth player that's actually transitioned into the senior space, but because of the way that they conduct themselves and the way that they actually give themselves an opportunity to maximize their successful outcomes, and it's consistent, they're doing it consistently, the older players around them start to respect them very, very quickly. And you actually start to find in certain instances that the older players are starting to look at them as role models as well. So I think there's a huge balance of how that actually works. And again, I think if you've got role models in that senior space that will bring the younger players into their environment, I've been incredibly unfortunate that I've been in environments where we've had a lot of senior players that have either transitioned out of a full-time professional career, come back down into a sub-elite environment, and then youth players have come into that senior space, and the senior ex-professional players are giving them tips, cues, supporting them, because they know that they're going to be the next one. And I've actually seen some of these players come through the system and now go on and currently playing in some of the top leagues in the world, because they had the support of a role model, someone that they could look up to. But that role model also understood that they're coming on the back end of their journey, but this player's only just starting their journey as well. So bringing them together and having that blend of youth and experience is incredibly important to the environments that you create as well.
Fantastic. And what are the most important factors of the senior environment that youth players need to be able to cope with or handle?
Yeah, I think I've touched on it already. It's one, breaking into the senior environment. It's a completely different beast altogether. The approach is completely different, potentially because it is a win at all costs. And it's not just a win at all costs for the team to get the 3 points or to win the cup match or to move into the next round of a competition. It's a win at all costs for the individuals as well, because they want to be in that starting 11. And I don't care who you are or what environment that you've coached in. It's always easy to manage the first 11. It's how you actually manage the other 11 that are on the brink, are not quite there, and ensuring that you're providing them that opportunity, that there is light. They will have an opportunity if it does present itself, but once that opportunity has been afforded to them, they grasp it with both hands as well. And that's very much what I've seen with youth players as well, is to, once you're in that senior space, try not to get too ahead of yourself, try to understand where you're at, take stock and keep reflecting. And the reality is, have you got the mindset whereby you don't just want to be in that senior space because that's where you are at that given time and that's the top end or the echelon? You actually want to go to the next level. So you don't just want to be in the top 11, but you actually want to be in the top 5 of that top 11, in terms of, if your first name on the sheet and these are the reason why and these are the characteristics that you bring to that team, and then if you can start to have that mindset and that approach to the game, that might give you the better opportunity to actually go on to the top level. And noting the fact that it's only 1% of players actually do that. That's what you have to continually do, is take yourself through that cycle, give yourself those goals, making sure that they are realistic and measurable, they're not too out of reach. Understand the environment that you're currently in, but more importantly, understand the environment you actually want to get to. And it's easy to say, I want to be a professional player and I want to play at the top level, but how many of you actually know what the sacrifices are and the dedication and the discipline and the sacrifice you actually have to make to actually get to that level? And our jobs as coaches is to try and support players in doing that and recognizing their strengths and their areas of improvement. And we keep talking to it. It's easy to get there, but how do you actually stay there? And having that mindset and approach.
Yeah, brilliant. And what interventions, what support is given to the players to help with transition? So, some examples, have you seen sort of buddy systems in place, any sort of workshops, education sort of pieces around that? Any integration activities, staff support? Now, I know you've mentioned, individual development plans and working with those and sort of having goals in place. But just sort of interested to know if there's any specific sort of education work done or support systems in place around those transitions.
Yeah, I've talked already to the role modeling and recognizing if you have a senior group. Usually in the environments I've been in previously, I've developed a senior working group, and that senior working group is not only to support what the overall team goals are at that top end in that performance phase, but what are our outcomes and what do we actually want to provide in terms of environment for players actually coming through the system as well. So I would always bring youth players into the senior working group just to be a fly on the wall and be in and around and understand that environment and those types of conversations. And that can be quite tricky to manage as well, because sometimes those conversations can be quite robust, open, and there's a lot of conflict in there as well. But what we're hoping to do is provide the players with these types of situations where they understand that, yes, there's conflict going on right now, but it's going to stay within the 4 walls. And then this might be a situation that you find yourself in later down the track in your career. And then how would you actually manage that? So I've been quite, I guess, fortunate to sort of do my career back to front, if you will, in terms of coach development provided me so much in terms of how to become a better coach myself. So I almost became a coach developer before I became a coach, but becoming a coach developer actually gave me the tools to become a better coach, and learning from those environments and those experiences that others on courses have had. I'll be honest, I've stolen ideas and I've used those ideas. I often listen to podcasts and actually go, wow, that's absolutely fantastic. I'll test that and I'll try that. And I guess that's the luxury that I have in my particular role, where I'm able to do that. Another one from a youth perspective would be that I always, having been and lived and breathed much the same as yourself, a TD in the NPL space in particular, or even in a Hull Academy, is replicating the environment in the youth space that you're going to find in the senior space as well. So the actual communication strategies might be completely different depending on the age and stage, but the types of things that you actually do in that environment are very, very similar. So if a player is accelerated and they are put into a senior environment, it's not unfamiliar to them. So they're not like a fish out of water. They've already seen it because they've already been doing a lot of it in that youth space. So whether that is individual development plans, whether that is logging what their day looks like, if they have a job outside of football as well, what their RPEs are, how much rest have they actually been getting, what is their daily activity. So they're doing exactly the same things as what the senior players are doing in the youth space, and that's even from a prehab point of view. So when they're going through their routines of injury prevention and management, they step into that senior environment and they go, wow, other than these guys being potentially a little bit better, older, a little bit more experienced, it's exactly the same as what I've been doing down here in the youth space, which is a lot easier to transition into that space as well. And then again, if you treat them as individuals, look at the characters that you've also got in your senior space, and then what characters do you have within that senior space that are similar to the ones that are actually coming through. So the introverts, the extroverts, the ones that are loud, the ones that are quiet, the ones that like to be bold and brash, and that doesn't matter whether you're a youth or a senior player. But then if you actually just pull them together and actually buddy them up, like you said before, that can be a great tool as well. And setting up workshops whereby senior players tell their journey of where they've come from, what they've done, what it took to get to the top level, and what they need to do as an individual if they're really, really serious about getting there. And one of the things that we've recently done at Football New South Wales during this testing time is the masterclass sessions for our talent support program players. And the insights, although the players have had very different journeys as individuals, but the insights, the commonalities are quite staggering, that they're very, very similar, that they have played at different levels in different countries, have all had different journeys, like whether they're a regional player, a metropolitan player, they made the state team, they didn't make the state team, but when it gets to the top end and how they actually got to the top end, the commonalities between what it takes to actually get there. So therefore, leaning on those experiences and getting the insights from players that have played at the top level, I think adds to that and showcases what it really takes to be a top end player, and how you'll give yourself the best opportunity to transition from youth into that senior space.
Yeah, I like that. Certainly through the research that I'm doing and the people that I've spoken to, it certainly does. You certainly do see a number of commonalities that are coming through in terms of the topic that we're talking about. And I think, this is hence the purpose of the research, is to try and, really nut those commonalities out, so that then we can provide some sort of a framework for players to look at, to work within, to support them on their journey. I can also echo as well your thoughts there around coach education. Having been myself involved in that space for about 6 or so years, it certainly helped me to become a better coach, which I never really expected when I first started that journey, because I sort of thought, you go into an environment where you're teaching people, but you always get a bunch of different sort of questions, and everyone's had different experiences, worked in different environments. So yeah, I find every coaching course that I'm on certainly challenges me and puts me out of my comfort zone, and obviously enhances my knowledge as well. So yeah, so I guess the next part of it is around you expressing or telling us about some of your experiences of players that you may have worked with that have made that transition. So maybe one example of a player that was successful in doing that, and what the reasons for that player what the reasons were for that player being successful in making that transition, and then obviously the flip side of that, an unsuccessful one, and why it wasn't a success for them.
Yeah, I've been very, very fortunate to work with many potentially talented players that have made it to the top level, but unfortunately there's many more that haven't, and that's just the reality of the game and how cutthroat it can actually be. Probably a couple of good news stories right now is actually seeing players that have come through the system. I've worked now here in Australia for the last 16 years. 2008, so I'll do my math here whether that's correct or not. Around 15-16 years, and worked across multiple member federations. So started off in Western Australia, moved across to the ACT, Canberra, and then from Canberra here into New South Wales. And throughout my journey, I've worked in high performance youth development spaces. And over that 16-year period, it's now I'm starting to see the fruits of the labour in terms of players coming through the system and making it to the top level. I was actually just talking to a player last week around potentially doing a masterclass for us. He's only 20 years of age. And he moved over to the UK a couple of years ago. Sorry, he's 24 now. He moved over to the UK around about 3 years ago. He left from Perth Glory and went to Scotland. He then moved from Scotland into the UK, and he's last year with Cambridge United just got promoted into League One. And he was very much at the time with Cambridge on the fringes. And I've liked to track all of the players that I've only had like minimal time with, but he's now he's established himself as a first team player within Cambridge United, and is doing incredibly well. And I think he's got a great career ahead of him. He's already having a great career, but for him to see him now regularly playing and holding down that position only shows that he's a testament to his own dedication. I think what's also important to state is the fact that no one coach is responsible for developing a player. I've known this lad since he was 12 years old. I've known him, and at the age of 13, he had the opportunity to either become or go in, have a scholarship to become a wrestler, or to actually take football as his preferred option, and he made that decision, and then he was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. So he very early on had a lot of challenges health wise, and how he was actually going to manage that, and he came away. He represented Australia at under 13s level, under 14s level. He was picked in state teams, he was picked in NTC teams, etc. And then he had a bit of time out. He struggled with injury, broke into the team at Perth Glory, and then moved overseas, and is now starting to really flourish over there in the UK. So that's a great story. But likewise, I've seen players again during my time when I was in the ACT that have demonstrated fantastic potential of being afforded an opportunity. Again, they've come through the ranks and they've gone on, and they ended up overseas as well. But it seems to be that race to get overseas first and foremost. But what a lot of players, especially young players, don't understand is how difficult it is, one, to get the opportunity to go across. If you do get the opportunity to go across, hold it down and stick it out. And there's going to be some times where you're going to have some dark times where you miss family, you miss home, you miss the lifestyle of Australia and what that affords you, and how fortunate we are to live in the country that we actually do. And go into some pretty dreary places around the world where professional football is played, and you don't necessarily see the sunshine as much as what you do in Australia. And the challenge is whereby we think opportunities are few and far between. Here they're even less when you go overseas and into those environments, and it can become really cutthroat, and people will be ruthless. People will try to pull you down, and you have to have a mindset that is going to be really, really strong, and give yourself that best opportunity as well. So putting yourself in those circles, and I've seen many a player, not just in ACT, WA, or here in New South Wales, that have gone over and haven't been able to cope, and they don't necessarily have the support network of their family over there as well. So that can be a challenge. So yeah, I'm fortunate that there's a lot of positive ones, but unfortunately there's a lot of not so positive experiences for players. And a lot of the time it's not because of technically or tactically them not being astute. It's because of the psychological and social framework hasn't been provided to them, the environments that they've been in previously that will set them up to succeed when they do go on to that next level.
Yeah, and that's sort of you know, you've hit some attributes or characteristics there around that sort of mental space, which then kind of takes us to the next question, which is, are there any characteristics in the categories of technical, tactical, physical, mental, social, that if a player does possess, provide a greater chance of that transition? So obviously from a mental perspective, you sort of said around that, you know, mental strength and having that. So yeah, anything around further around the mental side of it, or any of the other characteristics around certain attributes that might contribute to a successful transition?
Yeah, it's quite ironic that we're having this conversation, because we're just working through it now in terms of our talent support program, our Institute Girls program as well, and how or what environments are we going to create to give the boys or the girls the best opportunity to go to the next level, or to be afforded an opportunity to go into a national teams camp. And then what are those characteristics, and what are the types of things that they'll need as a player, as an individual. And Drew Taylor, who is the head of player development for boys at Football New South Wales, always talks to being adaptable, brave and creative. And if you can get players as individuals to strive to win every moment, that's what he's looking for. And we're actually just going through it now. So if we were to take all 5 of those and actually break them up, we're getting into some real detail as what it takes. But certainly from a psychological perspective, there's a lot of fantastic stuff out there already. The English FA have done some great work on what their DNA characteristics are for individual players and their profiling, etc. And we've looked at a lot of that, and certainly I have done as an individual, and taken a lot of that, and taken some of those ideas. And although the wording might be slightly different, a lot of them resonate with us and what we're trying to achieve with our players, our youth players, to give them the best opportunity to one, be recognised, then given the opportunity at the next level. But once they've got that opportunity, to grasp it with both hands. And from a psychological perspective, you want them to be a winner. You want them to be relentless in their approach. You want them to have nerve strength, and that's something from the FA DNA, and they call it a robust inner belief to perform under pressure. But you have to develop that environment for them to actually want to go through that and be challenged and taken out of the comfort zone. And they're only going to be able to do that if they're self-aware, so that they understand and use those personal characteristics to maximize their own and the team's performance, and they have control from a psychological point of view as well. And again, this is from the English FA. They're able to regulate the approach, an emotional state, in order to maximize the performance again. So there's just some little things, areas where you can really work with these players in that psychological space and actually give them the best opportunity. But you have to create that environment as well. And I keep talking to developing the individual, that's what we have to do also. And then from a social perspective, when you link that to the psychological one as well, can we develop leaders? And they don't just lead by example from a communication perspective and being loud and being that extrovert, but they lead by example from the performances that they are able to produce week in, week out. And they have a presence and they have a demeanor where that comes to life and that comes out, and they have that real connection, and that's really important. And the FA here in Australia talk to that a lot. Certainly in and around the female game, how do you develop that connection, and how do you actually establish good working relationships with a team, and then having your own unique identity as well, but recognizing what that is and not giving that up. Don't try and be somebody else. Be yourself. Understand what your character is, and be unique to yourself. But be a team player, and most importantly, be a good person, and hopefully that will give you the best opportunity to move on to succeed at that next level.
Yeah, brilliant. And final question, what what would your expectations be if you were, say, coaching a team, and you had a youth player transitioning into either, your senior training session or your matches? What would your expectations be of that youth player? So would you expect them to come up and dominate play straight away, or have an immediate impact, or is it more of a settling in period? And if it is a settling in period, like how long would you potentially give them? What would you sort of do? What would your expectations
I
be
think
around that?
throughout the whole of this interview, I've talked to the individual. So depending on who that individual is,
Sure.
what their journey's been, they've got themselves to a certain level where, one, they're being looked at. And then our job as coaches and support staff is, what support do we give them to maximize them to transition as quickly as possible into the environment, but not just transition into the environment, be able to stay in the environment, have that no fear of failure, but to not come in and go be over the top with how they actually project themselves, and be that young, cheeky, play with a smile on your face, enjoy it, enjoy the environment, enjoy the experience, but don't get ahead of yourself, because you'll still have a long way to go, and that doesn't matter what environment you go into. So if you can be honest with yourself, honest where you're currently at, but where you want to be, that would be the first thing I would be doing as a coach. I would be wanting to sit down with the player as an individual, try to get an understanding of them. Where do they currently feel they sit at? Is it a daunting experience for them coming into a senior environment? Is it something they're looking forward to? And then how do we actually maximize them embracing that and want to stay in that environment? And like I say, we hear about players that have dedicated their time and effort. And only today, this morning, was I speaking to a fellow coach who has just told me that 3 players have left because they were offered an opportunity to go into a senior environment. But once they got into that environment, it wasn't what they expected that environment to be. And not only have they left that particular club, they've left the game altogether because of the experience that they had. So be mindful of where they're currently at, and they're still very much adolescents a lot of the time. So how do you actually put that support network and framework around them to maximize their opportunity? But I'd be getting them in as individuals, sitting down with them and coming up with a roadmap for them, and coming up with an individual development plan. And that individual development plan would probably look quite different in terms of what they've done as a youth player, because it's now about the performance phase. And then what can we do to provide that environment for you, but what will you have to do as an individual to really maximize you staying in that environment? And I would always be going in, certainly at the levels I've coached at, that it's as part of your journey. Our journey is not to get you into this team and play in this team, it's to get you to the next level and the next level after that. So what tools can we give you in your time? And hopefully it's only a short time with us, because you're going to move on to the next level, and best prepare yourself to keep stepping up. And hopefully the ultimate goal, certainly for myself and the environments that I work in, is it's about getting players into the green and gold, and what part do we play for that individual player, so the green and gold have more depth, and it's not just 11 players. Great. How do we now start to create a conveyor belt of players coming through the system where they have that depth, and they're struggling to pick a team because there's too many good players, not the other way around. There's not enough good players, and that takes time as well. And there's been some fantastic work done in the last 10 years, but we're still a long way to go. Still a very much in its infancy and an evolving nation. But you only have to look at what the Matildas and the Socceroos are doing right now, and there's players coming through the system, but we just need to continually develop more of those. And the best way for us to do that is through our coach development programs as well, and understanding the environments that we're working in and the ages and stages we're actually working with as coaches and the individuals we have in front of us.